Welcome, viewers and listeners, to another edition of CHP Talks. We're back here with one of our very favorite guests of all time, Dr. Charles Hoffe. Charles, thank you for taking the time to be with our viewers and listeners today.
Well, thank you, Rod. When I speak to your viewers and listeners, I am in my tribe, which are those who love Christ. And so thank you for having me on your show.
Amen. Well, probably almost everyone listening knows who Dr. Charles Hoffe is, but I'm still going to give a little introduction here for anyone who may have not been paying attention to BC medical, political activities over the last few years. Dr. Charles Hoffe is a Christian family physician. He lives and works in Lytton, British Columbia. He's a graduate of the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa. He moved to Canada in 1990 and has been a family physician and ER physician to the community of Lytton, BC since 1993. And I note that that's over 30 years. As a doctor and a Christian, Dr. Hoffe is a fervent advocate of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. After seeing serious harm in his own patients from the experimental COVID vaccines, he has been an outspoken advocate for patient safety and medical ethics. And because of his honest patient advocacy with the province and with the College of Physicians and Surgeons, he has been threatened and punished by the medical authorities. And he's no longer permitted to work at this date as an emergency physician to have access to the hospital. And he's been, quote, under investigation by the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons for what they consider the crime of causing vaccine hesitancy, because he has questioned the safety of the experimental COVID vaccines. And Dr. Hoffe recently, and we're glad about this, has had a partial victory in that the college has dropped their charges of misconduct. So that's sort of recent news, and we're going to talk to Dr. Hoffe about that. And so tell us what just happened. Most of our viewers will know about your long saga of representing your patients and patient safety. But what's happened recently, and why is it only a partial victory?
Well, those are good questions. So maybe to summarize very briefly, I got in trouble for revealing the evidence of harm from what the government was doing to the people through the COVID injections. And I was a first-hand witness, and so I was an early whistleblower. They didn't like that at all. And so I sent a letter to Bonnie Henry back 4 years ago to tell her what the shots were doing to my patients and to show her that, and I gave her all the statistics for our community, that it was pretty clear to me that the shots were more dangerous than COVID in terms of how many people we had treated for COVID or who had died of COVID and how many people now had had the shots and were either dead or seriously injured from them. So the college's response to this open letter was to issue a warning to every other doctor in BC, and the same colleges did it right across Canada, that doctors were not allowed to spread misinformation about COVID or COVID vaccines. And if they did that, they would be disciplined. They would be investigated and, if necessary, disciplined. So they considered my announcement of what the shots were doing to my patients as misinformation. And so I was in due course put under investigation. And then in February of 2022, they announced to the national media that I was going to be disciplined and that they were going to appoint a disciplinary panel to hear the case and to discipline me. And it amazed me that when they announced this, that they issued a press release to the media before they told me about this. And I literally had to go to their website and find out about this once I was told about this by a reporter. And so I realized that this was just phase two of their warning to doctors, that if you contradict the government narrative, you will be punished. And so this announcement of my impending punishment was just further intimidation of the doctors. If you want to run a medical tyranny, you have to have the support of the medical profession. And so, of course, those in regulatory bodies and positions of high authority could be bought with money. But the masses needed to be controlled with fear. And this is what they did. And so various news media publications over this process have publicized that I am a spreader of misinformation, that I have put people at risk, that I have said things that are untrue, and that I am going to be disciplined. And I have, in fact, been their example of what happens to you if you resist the government, if you contradict their narrative. So by the grace of God, my trial got adjourned 4 times. And the first couple of times were for things that I had, the first time was that the lawyers hadn't correctly scheduled the time, and so it got adjourned. And then my lawyer was sick, and it got adjourned. And then I realized that I needed a different kind of lawyer. That trying to appeal this on freedom of speech grounds, because we're supposed to have freedom of speech in Canada under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But that had all gone out the window. Clearly, by telling doctors that you're not allowed to disagree, they had shut down freedom of speech for the medical community. So I then got a lawyer called Lee Turner, who's in Kelowna, who then assembled this formidable team of experts. And when we submitted the expert testimonies of these 8 world experts, the college's response, they were clearly horrified. They thought, the college almost never loses a case because they have massive resources and they pick the jury. This disciplinary panel were people who worked for them. So I wasn't expecting justice. When you're being tried by your accuser who has picked the jury, and they are the jury, the accuser, the jury, judge, and executioner, you shouldn't expect justice. That's not how justice works. So I realized this was in the hands of God, because the college almost never loses a case. But when the college's lawyers, and by the way, they had 7 lawyers that worked on my case during this process. So they have massive resources. And of course, Trudeau had handed out huge handouts to pretty well every regulatory body so that they could do this sort of thing. So when they saw the evidence that was stacked against them, the first thing they did was to try to bury it through this process called judicial notice that most people have heard about. Most people before the pandemic had never heard about it. And I'd never heard about it before the college used it against me. But this was a way to try and bury evidence so that the court wouldn't see it. And by the grace of God, my lawyer, who is a Christian and a wise, clever man, used this as an opportunity to actually get the evidence of harm to this disciplinary panel who hadn't seen it because it wasn't court documents. So when this disciplinary panel saw this, and I had been praying for these 5 members of this disciplinary panel for 3 years since they were appointed. I think they have no idea how much I have prayed for them. I have prayed that they would be honorable, that they would be honest, and that they would be upstanding. And God has answered that prayer. They have turned out to be honorable, upstanding, honest people. But the college's lawyers, who are clearly not in that category was desperately trying to prevent the evidence from getting to these 5 people who I was praying for. And so when this disciplinary panel refused to grant judicial notice, that was a landmark victory for Canada because it literally set a new precedent. That principle of law had been so misused in this pandemic to just railroad things through the courts, and suddenly that put the brakes on it.
Judicial notice, just for our listeners who may not have heard the term before, judicial notice would be asking the court to accept at face value the position of the college, which they claimed was a scientific consensus, and that there's no use even thinking about any alternative worldview on those issues, right?
Yes, precisely. So when lawyers set out their case, their first page is the facts, and they list their facts, bullet points or listed. And the first fact was that the COVID vaccines are safe and effective. So if they were going to grant judicial notice to the facts of the college, which was what these lawyers were asking for, it would mean that you're not allowed to say that they're not safe and effective. And therefore, you cannot talk about vaccine injuries, and you cannot talk about safety signals, or you cannot bring any evidence that contradicts the fact that they're safe and effective. That is what the college wanted declared as irrefutable. And so when they didn't succeed with that, that was a huge problem. And the college's response to that, because initially I should mention, the college had one expert witness, who was Dr. Trevor Cornell. He was Dr. Bonnie Henry's right-hand man through the first 2 years of the pandemic. He is a family doctor who specialized in epidemiology and public health. So he actually wasn't an expert in any of the areas that I was accused of misconduct. I was accused of saying that the COVID shots cause microclotting and neurological injuries and myocarditis and fertility problems and a whole list like that. And he wasn't an expert in any of those areas, but yet he was their expert. And so when they realized that I had 8 expert witnesses, world experts in each of these areas to deal with the area of accusation, they said, well, now we want 8 expert witnesses, because they realized that they were completely outgunned and outmaneuvered. So they said they want 8 expert witnesses too. So they set off to try and find, and they never managed to find the 8. They found some of them, but and all the ones they found were all people who had received money from the pharmaceutical industry. So these were all people who had conflicts of interest. They were not, an expert witness is supposed to be somebody who is an impartial expert, who gives their expertise about a certain thing without any allegiance to either party in the trial. They're supposed to be an objective, impartial expert witness. And all of the college's expert witnesses had received money from the pharmaceutical industry. And actually, I'm not sure about Dr. Trevor Cornell, whether he had, but anyway, the others had. And so
he obviously, anyway, was a direct beneficiary of the policy. If he was Bonnie Henry's right hand man, then he was up to his elbows in the process of denying any potential vaccine safety concerns.
Yes, and by the grace of God, because I was wondering how I was going to pay for this. When I realized that I needed a different kind of lawyer and I got Lee Turner, I had no idea how I was going to pay for this. And I had been, it's part of my upbringing that you don't ask people for money. You just don't do that. If somebody offers it to you, that is wonderful. Praise the Lord. But you don't go with your hat out asking for money. And so I wasn't quite sure what to do. And the Lord led a man called Ted Kuntz, who's the president of Vaccine Choice Canada, who I had met through all this craziness. And he came to me and he said, "How are you going to pay for this?" And I said, "I haven't a clue. I have no idea." I'd been fired from the ER, so I'd lost half of my income. And I had so many legal expenses from my divorce, where my wife was very aggressively trying to take me down. And I had no idea how I was going to pay for this. And Ted said, "Well, you need to set up a crowdfunding website." And I said, "Yes, but I'm concerned that these people who hate me, who are trying to effectively discredit me and destroy me, will seek every opportunity to defame me and to discredit me. And so if there is a crowdfunding website, I must be completely independent of it. In other words, nobody should be able to say that I'm asking money for legal fees and it's going into my back pocket."
Yeah.
I wanted to be above reproach. So I said to Ted, "Would you be willing to administer it, and you be the go-between between this fund and the lawyer, and so that the money never comes to me in any form?" And so he agreed to do that. And by the grace of God, that has so far provided everything. All of the 8 expert witnesses offered to give their massive amounts of work free of charge. And my lawyer had told me that 8 expert witnesses of the caliber that I have had, you could expect to pay them each about $50,000 for their testimony and for their work and for their time. It's a massive amount of work. And yet every single one had done it at no cost to me, completely on their own dime. This is the glory and provision of God. When God says, you just stand back and I will fight for you, this is what has happened. So when the judicial notice tactic didn't work to bury the evidence, the college then scheduled the trial at a time when they knew my lawyer was not available. And when I objected to this, they said, "Well, you just need to get another lawyer," because they knew that my lawyer was a very skilled lawyer. And I was really looking forward to hearing him cross-examine these expert witnesses from the college, because I knew he was just going to expose them for what they were. And so, fortunately, this tribunal, the disciplinary panel, turned out to be honorable people. And they said, despite what the college's lawyers were advising them, that it's not fair, that I should just have to get another lawyer. This was a very complex case that they had scheduled 3 weeks to hear it. It wasn't fair that I shouldn't be allowed to have the lawyer of my choice. And so they answered prayer again. And so when they then, well, firstly, couldn't find 8 expert witnesses, and they couldn't bury the evidence, and they couldn't exclude my lawyer, they just dropped everything because they didn't want the evidence to be presented.
So
that's where we've got to now.
That evidence was never actually heard by the tribunal. Is that correct then?
Well, no. What happened was the college's lawyers desperately didn't want this disciplinary panel to even see the evidence. That's why they applied for judicial notice. They didn't want them to ever see it. They just wanted them to know what the government's told them, that they're safe and effective. And my lawyer used his response to their application for judicial notice as a way of getting that information to the disciplinary panel. In his response to their application, he then put in large parts of their expert testimonies as part of his application, as part of his response, so that suddenly these people could see the could see a lot of the evidence. And that is why they didn't grant judicial notice, because they said, this is crazy. How can you, there is significant evidence. How can we say this is irrefutable? And so he completely thwarted their evil by that clever tactic and literally set a precedent for Canada that will benefit this nation in the years to come.
Very, very good. That's excellent. And then the follow-up to that question is, I mean, it's a great thing that they've dropped these charges. And they dropped them because they saw the evidence was stacked against them. But you still do not have hospital privileges. Is that correct? They were looking for some way to discredit you. They wanted to charge you with misconduct. They were not able to do that. But why are you not allowed to work in the hospital where you had worked for many years previously?
That is the Interior Health Authority, who have also been extremely draconian and extremely dishonest. When I saw the vaccine injuries that my patients had, I submitted vaccine injury reports to Interior Health, to Dr. Carol Fenton in Kamloops, reporting these vaccine injuries. And her response at first was to issue press releases and do news releases to say that despite what I was saying, there was no evidence of harm from the COVID vaccines, and effectively calling me a liar, saying that what I was saying had no foundation in truth. I don't know why she thought I would be saying it. I mean, why would one want to lie about your patients being harmed? I mean, it's just really strange. I mean, maybe she thought I was just stirring things up or something. But when I sent her these vaccine injury reports are 9-page documents that go into incredible detail. They give the batch number, they give the times, the dates, and symptoms, and what happened where. They were very time consuming to fill out. And after I'd sent the first 6, and she was doing press releases to say there was no evidence of harm, I thought, well, maybe she's not being dishonest. Maybe she just never got them. Maybe she actually is an honorable person. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. So I then went back and I redid the whole lot. I mean, it was laborious. Filling out those 9-page forms takes about 25 minutes per patient. I submitted 14 of them. So do the math, and you get paid absolutely zero for that. This is on your own dime. Hours and hours of work, meticulously documenting what's happened to each of your patients. And in every single case, they were denied by public health. They said these are not vaccine injuries, and they didn't examine the patients. They didn't. This was just done. It was so anyway. So Interior Health is very guilty. They are the ones that fired me from the ER, and that remains in place because that was not done by the college. That is Interior Health. They fired me from the ER. Well, firstly, they had given me a gag order to tell me I was not allowed to say anything negative about these shots in the course of my work in the ER. So they were shutting down freedom of speech for me. That was before the college did it to the whole nation, all the doctors in the nation. And so when I was very vocal about what was happening to my patients because I was so angry about it. Doctors are not supposed to harm patients. Public health is supposed to keep people safe. And they weren't. And the fact that they denied it and called me a liar, effectively, that's what, when you accuse somebody of spreading misinformation, you're saying they're a deceiver or a liar. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
That is what they were accusing me of. And yet I knew that that is exactly what they were doing. And so they set out to discredit me through the media. They have the power of the media, and they have done that for 4 years. But Galatians chapter 6 says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows." And so they try to defame me and discredit me and bring disgrace upon me. But yet, what they have done has literally brought disgrace upon themselves. It has shown that I have been the one who has been honest, and I have been the one who has had integrity. And the fact that they have now dropped everything is their admission of the fact that they no longer believe that I'm a spreader of misinformation, which means that they are the spreaders of misinformation because their tune has been the exact opposite. So, what they have done to destroy me has destroyed their own credibility and revealed their lack of integrity.
I see that the college tried to cover that when they dropped the misconduct charges against you. They said, well, there's been material changes in the world, basically meaning that the COVID crisis is over. They didn't say there's been material changes in our understanding of the evidence. They're not apologizing for anything. They just trying to say, well, we're just dropping the charges because there's no point in continuing. But anyway, that's great. No, for the things that you were seeing early in the game, I know we've discussed this in the past on when you've been on previous shows, but just for our viewers and listeners, the things that you were noticing in your patients that you had administered the Moderna shots, correct? Or you had participated?
No, so I did. Yeah, I did not vaccinate anyone.
Okay.
That was put out on the internet. It was a misunderstanding. It was an assumption. My Barney Henry letter said that 900 people in my community had been vaccinated. So people then assumed I had done that.
Okay.
It was not me. I knew there was no evidence of safety, and I had said right from the start, I will have no part of this. I am going to stand and watch. I will be an observer because you can't decide that a new treatment is safe after testing it for 2 months. That is ridiculous. And that's what they had done.
You observed harm they were your patients, even though you did not administer the vaccine to them. And you saw change take place after the vaccination.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I was just the gatherer of the evidence. I was like the gospel writer Luke, who after Christ's ascension went around to all the eyewitnesses to put all the pieces of the story together to write this beautiful gospel that gives us this chronological account of Christ. So I was a bit like that. I was the observer. I was to go and speak to these other eyewitnesses who were my patients who had been vaccinated and to report it.
And you sent a letter to Bonnie Henry asking how you were supposed to deal with that. And instead of giving you medical advice or even acknowledging what you were noticing as an observant physician, she went after you to try to get you to stop speaking the truth about what you were seeing.
That is correct. And Rod, the college actually gave 3 reasons for why they dropped everything after this 4 years of persecution. And one of them, as you mentioned, is they said, well, things have changed. Well, that is very vague, and we don't know what they mean by that. We have no idea. Things are always changing, but if a person has committed a crime, the passage of time doesn't make that crime legal. I suppose unless the law changed or something and that it was no longer a crime. I don't know. I don't know what they mean by that. but one of the things that they did say that is very chilling, just as the colleges and public health had sought to shut down freedom of speech with doctors in this pandemic, and they did it firstly to me personally. Interior Health did it by giving me this gag order, and then the college essentially gave a gag order to every doctor across Canada, warning them not to speak misinformation. And this misinformation idea is an arbitrary term. It simply means that you don't agree with the government. That's all it means. And of course, the government's opinion is constantly changing. So obviously, yeah, I mean, they're and often contradictory, and so it's an arbitrary term to just discredit people. But they shut down freedom of speech related to these COVID vaccines. But here in British Columbia, we now have the HPOA, which was Bill 36, the Health Practitioners and Occupations Act. And in the letter to my lawyer, where the college explained that they were withdrawing their charges against me, they said, we now have a substantial body of legislation in place where doctors can be disciplined for misinformation. And that one of the reasons why they dropped the charges against me is that my citation has already fulfilled its purpose. I was the example to every other doctor out there of what will happen to you if you dare to disagree with them. So this was a blatant admission that they now have this big stick called the HPOA, the Health Practitioners and Occupations Act, which is in place. The college is redoing their bylaws to conform to it, that if a doctor speaks what they would call misinformation, and as I said, that's a completely arbitrary idea. It simply means disagreeing with them. Under that, if you're just a regular doctor, it's $200,000 fine plus 6 months in jail. If you have a medical corporation, which most doctors have, if you have a private practice, which I have, it is a $500,000 fine for misinformation plus 6 months in jail. So this simply, in BC, doctors now no longer have freedom of speech by law, which of course is highly unconstitutional. This is a complete infringement of our charter rights. But the problem for this is that when a patient goes to a doctor and the doctor explains to them what they might suggest for a treatment, to have any treatment, a patient needs to have informed consent. Informed consent means that the doctor informs you of the pros, the cons, and the alternatives. In other words, what are the advantages of doing this? What are the disadvantages? And what are the alternatives? And the patient can then weigh that up. If a doctor is no longer allowed to tell you certain things because they're terrified of the $500,000 fine, they can't give you informed consent because there's certain things they're not allowed to say. So the impacts for this, for the entire public, that doctors no longer have freedom of speech is enormous. It means that patients can no longer trust doctors because the doctors are living with this sword of Damocles over their head that they will get much worse than what I've had. I never had the $500,000 fine. I was let off, but I could have. So we are in a desperate situation. There is no doctor in their right mind that should still be practicing medicine in British Columbia. No doctor should be able to. I mean, you can't practice medicine unless you can give your honest opinion about treatments without being worried that the government's going to slap this enormous fine on you and put you in jail.
No.
And yet, this is the legacy of our socialist government here in British Columbia. This is Adrian Dix, who put this in place, who was our health minister. His name is on the document. This is partly why our healthcare system is collapsing, because tyranny, you can't work under tyranny. I came to Canada thinking it was a land of freedom and opportunity, and unfortunately, it has completely changed.
Yeah, it once was a land like that, and we hope one day it will return to that. But in the meantime, we are facing terrible forces of pressure and as you mentioned, tyranny. So, do you see any possible change? I know the government has not completely changed. There's been a change in the BC government, but not enough of a change. It looks, is Bonnie Henry, is everything still going on as it was before in terms of this push? And I noticed that on the Federal Liberal website, their webpage, they are promoting mandatory vaccinations still, as if there's no new information. And of course, if they deny the public access to real information, they can continue to fool some of the people, at least some of the time. It's a terrible thing that the truth has been undermined, censored, and blocked.
Yes, and praise God for the internet. If this pandemic had happened 30 years ago, when we didn't have an internet and people were at the mercy of the legacy media, things would have been very different. 30 years ago, we didn't have Zoom meetings. We didn't have this alternative media that could get their message out. We sort of relied on the sort of local newspaper or the radio or the television to find out what was actually happening. And what we found in this tyranny that we now live in is that almost nothing that the legacy media tells us is reliable, because you never know what parts of it are true and what parts of it are not true. And you never know what things they're just not telling you, so that you come to the wrong conclusion, because you can completely deceive someone by just giving them some of the facts and leaving out crucial other things that would completely change their opinion. And so by selective reporting and by blatant misinformation, the legacy media have misled this nation through this entire pandemic. And so it's my hope for the future that people will remember who has deceived them. Have remembered that almost everything that public health told us about COVID and the COVID vaccines turned out to be untrue. Almost everything. And almost everything that the media told us about COVID and the COVID vaccines turned out to be untrue. And the same for our elected officials. And so people need to know that the strongest predictor of future behavior is past behavior. People who have lied to you in the past, who have deceived you and abused you in the past, will probably do it again. And so it's nice to be forgiving, but trust has been lost, and we need, yes, we can forgive them, but we won't trust them. You can forgive somebody that has done evil to you, but you'd be a fool to trust them unless you have good reason to believe that they have been radically changed.
Yeah. Well, when you mentioned the media, I just reread an article, a CBC article written 3 years ago when the college was, coming after you, and before they had to face this mountain of evidence, overwhelming evidence that they didn't want to deal with. But the CBC article, like, I really lament the loss of honesty in journalism in Canada. It has become opinion and I should say biased opinion journalism. So in that article written by a CBC reporter who is not a doctor and has no depth of medical knowledge, they were using terms against you to about you saying things that were incorrect, that you were misinformation, that you were leading your patients astray, that you were a menace to public safety. I mean, they weren't just reporting on the fact that the college was going after you. They inserted right in the article that you were making incorrect statements. Well, those statements had never been verified or never been confirmed to be incorrect by any panel of justice. CBC reporter accepted that, he took it as a judicial notice, and he or she accepted the college's point of view without questioning. And so that, in the public in the eye of the public, you became an outlaw just by virtue of the CBC reporter, who, by the way, is paid by taxpayers, supporting, our subsidy to the CBC. So, of course, they're beholden to the government narrative. So that's something that we fight against all the time, this blatant media bias. But it is part of the world we live in. And so, Dr. Hoffe, what else before we close? And I want to be sure to give people your website before we close, but any part of this debacle that we haven't covered that we need to make sure our viewers and listeners are aware of?
I just want to give glory to God, who has been with me from, sometimes the storm is bad, like when the disciples were in that boat and they thought their boat was about to sink, and Christ was taking a nap in the back of the boat, and they were terrified because they knew they were about to die. Those waves were about to swamp their boat, and they were going to go down into that cold, inky darkness in the middle of that enormous lake. And they were afraid. And yet all they had to do was appeal to Christ, and everything changed. All he had to do was raise his arm and say, "Peace, be still." And they had a dead calm. God has been through this. If God has been in the details, God has unfolded this thing in ways that I would never have expected. He has provided, just as he provided to get 8 world-class experts to submit almost 1,000 pages of brilliant scientific information set out in a legal format for a court presentation is a massive task, and yet it was provided free of charge.
Wow.
To the fact that God has just provided, this has been God's battle, and he gets the glory, because what happened to me was actually unprecedented in Canada. Just a few months ago, Dr. Mark Trozzi went through exactly the same thing. He was firstly completely condemned by the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons, fined $95,000, and they took his medical license. He then went into the court system, the judicial system, to appeal it, and lost even more. He lost on every single point. So what happened with me? What suddenly made a difference? A couple of months later, where instead of losing on every single point and being left with this crippling fine, I am completely vindicated. It is like the absolute polar opposite. And what was the difference? The difference was Jesus Christ. The difference is God. That I have put my trust and faith in God, not in my lawyer, not in the evidence. I have been praying for the members of that disciplinary panel, that God would grant me favor in their eyes, that God would lift that veil so that they could actually see the truth. And God has done that. God has done that. So this is a testimony to the glory of God and the power of prayer and the importance of just not being afraid. Don't give up. Christ is with you in that boat, even though the storm may rage. He can change anything in an instant. Like mine, I went from getting ready for that trial to like the dead calm. The storm's gone. Suddenly the charges are dropped. It's gone. It is gone. And so that is my message, that Canada is in dire straits, but God can change everything. All it needs is a few faithful people who will be fervent in prayer, who will stand, who will not back down in the face of tyrants and bullies, who will have the courage of their convictions and spend a lot of time on their knees. After this decision came down, and I would get text messages and emails from my friends saying, you must be celebrating. What are you doing to celebrate? And after the first week, I was still saying to them, all of my celebrations have been on my knees with many tears, all of them, before the throne of grace, praising God. That is my celebration.
Well, that's amazing and wonderful. I will be, by the time this airs next week, this will be going up on the 27th, I guess. I will be in Alberta speaking to some of our members in various places, Calgary, Lethbridge, and Edmonton. And the topic that I said I was going to speak on is riding out the storm. And because, and exactly the same thing, that we are in the boat is being rocked, the tempest is raging, but God is at the helm, and we need not fear. We are going to be facing some tough things ahead, and we must prepare for them, but we need not fear because Jesus is in the boat, and we can trust in him to work things out in the right way at the right time. So thank you for your service. I'm going to tell folks your website is drhoffe.ca, drhoffe.ca. We'll put that in the show notes as well. And there is a place, because you still do have some legal costs, right? In spite of all this generous contribution from these expert witnesses, you still have legal costs you need to meet. So there is a place there to make a donation. I encourage people to do that. So drhoffe.ca. And Dr. Charles Hoffe, thank you. You are an exemplary physician. You're a wonderful friend. I consider you a friend, and you're a friend of the freedom movement. You're a friend of medical sanity that we need back in this country, and you're a friend of truth. So God bless you. Thank you for being with us today, and may the Lord continue to lead you, guide you, protect you, and provide for you in this journey that you didn't choose, but God has prepared you for. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Rod. It's been an honor to be on your program again.
All right. God bless you.